First of all, thank you, Agata and Magdalena, for the invitation to come here, and Małgorzata for the organization. And it's just really nice to be here among friends. Because I'm well into the teaching semester, I've been rereading Linda Nochlin for my postmodern art course and decided to change my title slightly. So in his pioneering monograph on post-war art in the Shadow of Yalta, Art and the Avant-Garde in Eastern Europe, 1945 to 1989, Piotr Piotrowski explained the reason he included only limited examples of artists from Bulgaria and Albania. Quote, "I have spent more time on those countries where the post-war experience of modernism was richer and more dynamic, less where it did not play a significant role," end quote. With this statement, Piotrowski preferences the experience of modernism and examples of avant-garde experimentation over others. As we are aware, modernism prioritizes the avant-garde over the everyday or kitsch, progress and innovation over consistency and typicality. The experience of modernism also divided our experience into binaries, high and low, dominant and subordinate, West and East. Why then, in a field where we claim to want to move beyond the binaries of East and West, do we continue to pay lip service to Western modernist art historical structures? If we, as scholars and disciples of Piotrowski's approach of horizontal art history, hope to move beyond these models to a global contextualization, then we need the methods that can enable us to do so. When, in 1974, Linda Nochlin posed the question, why have there been no great women artists, she pointed out the problem with the question itself and the, quote, institutional structures themselves and the view of reality which they impose on the human beings who are part of them, end quote. Examining the field of East European art history reveals that we too have created our hierarchical structures, centers and peripheries, and suffer from our own blind spots. Why is the art of post-war art in Moldova, Albania, or Bulgaria rarely discussed, with the exception of the few artists who are internationally famous? Likewise, why do discussions of performance art, my specific area, continue to focus on the usual suspects, Milan Knižák, Tadeusz Kantor, Tomislav Gotovac, etc., and not Gennady Popescu, Flutura and Besnik Hadjilari, or Adelina Popnedelova? Could it be there are limits on language, materials, and access to them? These are some of the arguments that Western art historians use to exclude East European artists from the canon altogether. While I acknowledge that we all face limits in our research in writing the history of post-war art in East Central Europe, we have created our own canon with its own set of exclusions. Zooming in on the study of the history of performance art in the region of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe, my area of focus, tells us a lot about the geography of the region and its own interior hierarchical structure. Studies of the art form often focus on the actions and happenings in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary in the 1960s, and Yugoslavia in the 1970s, when performance art gained ground as a genre in its own right. Both decades being the heyday of performance art in the West as well. What are the contributions of Moldovan artists to this genre? And can we even say that they made any if their activity and performance started in the 1990s? In the introduction to In the Shadow of Yalta, Piotrowski also commented that he did not include Russian art in his book because it is, quote, fairly well covered terrain, end quote, nor the art of the Soviet Union because it, quote, did not have to contend with the Shadow of Yalta, end quote. The situation of Moldova is a perplexing one. While the area became part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century, having previously been an independent principality, it spent the previous 2 centuries being tossed back and forth between Russia and Romania, at times regaining independence until it became a Soviet republic in 1940. Indeed, it did not experience the Shadow of Yalta, but perhaps the shadow of Molotov-Ribbentrop, which has kept the country and its art literally in the shadows, and certainly not fairly well covered terrain. In fact, it is quite the opposite. We know and hear very little about post-war art in Moldova. I want to make clear that this is not a criticism of Piotrowski's book per se. He wrote the book that he wanted to write and could write, and it has made a significant contribution to the field. But I see it as an example of a disconcerting trend continuing in the field. One way that we as art historians of the region can rethink the geographies of East Central Europe is by rethinking the art historical models we use in our work. While we claim to want to challenge the notion of center and periphery and disrupt the canon, when we use the existing structures and methods developed by the discipline that excluded the work of artists we write about, we will only perpetuate those systems, not dismantle them. We need to first acknowledge our own centers and peripheries and our own exclusions, and once we do this, we can reconceptualize the space of East Central Europe, as well as the contributions of the artists therein. It is only by understanding our own blind spots that we can begin to negotiate the blind spots of the so-called center. My own model of writing the history of performance art of East Central Europe offers one possible solution, as it seeks to move beyond a temporal history. It presents, for example, the performance art that developed in Albania in the 1990s as an equal component of the story of performance art in the region, to the activity of Czechoslovakia in the 1960s, for example. In shifting our focus away from the development of artistic phenomena and genres across the region and focusing on the phenomena themselves, we emerge with a much richer picture of artistic activity and production in the region. In doing so, we can also escape the quandary of considering artistic production in terms of the communist, post-communist binary. A common trope from art historians in the region since the 1990s is the necessity of understanding the socio-political context from which this art emerged. This is mainly in response to writing and curating on the region that occurred around that time, which juxtaposed work from East Central Europe with that of Western Europe and North America, and completely ignored that specific context of art being produced under state-sponsored socialism. Such writing saw some work as derivative and not novel enough to be of any merit when compared to its counterparts from the West. While we now have an established body of secondary literature that can function as a model to future art historians on how to properly contextualize the art of East Central Europe, we have not followed our own advice when looking within our own regional borders. If, when writing about performance art from the region, we continue to preference the pioneers of performance, as well as conceptual and experimental art, and remain focused on the 1960s and 70s in Central Europe and Yugoslavia, we have excluded an entire body of work that developed at different times and different places due to the various socio-historical circumstances that we claim to be so integral to understanding the work. Take, for example, Moldova, a country wedged between East Russia and less East Romania. In the 1960s and 1970s, most of the experiment that occurred in the visual arts took place in painting, much like in other Soviet republics, for example, in the Baltics. Work that may not appear innovative nowadays in the realm of painting was problematic not just for artists, but for art historians. Moldovan scholar Dr. Ludmila Toma, writing about one artist's use of expressionist color and brushstroke during the Soviet period, was censored for her work and prevented from advancing in her career. Moldova experienced a similar fate that smaller republics elsewhere did, for example, Montenegro, where those seeking artistic training would depart for larger centers, such as Belgrade in the case of Montenegro. While there is an art academy in Chisinau, many artists left to study in Russia or Ukraine, leaving the country with a smaller support network and community for experimental activity. It wasn't until the late 1980s that the Phantom Group was established and started experimenting with performance and ephemeral art. Even to this day, the art scene in Moldova is quite compact, but producing active and engaging work. If we continue to dismiss and exclude this work because it came so late to the game, then we continue to buy into the Western modernist paradigm of progress and innovation. So, what if we started to address artists and their work not because it is necessarily innovative, but simply because it is compelling? In many ways, this reflects my own process of researching performance art in the region. When meeting with art historians and critics, they would invariably tell me to meet this or that artist because their work was interesting. Gennady Popescu, a contemporary artist from Chisinau, is one such artist. Unable to officially enter the art academy because he did not graduate from high school, he audited his way through his studies, following the complete course of a BFA degree without actually earning a diploma. Despite the Academy of Fine Arts in Chisinau still being relatively conservative, the artist began developing performance, participatory, and socially engaged art. He has created a number of performances and three-dimensional works using mamaliga, a Moldovan and Romanian form of polenta, and significant to Moldovan culture. And you see him here with a gigantic one that he pulled across the country in one of his performances. In many ways, mamaliga is a bridge between East and West, as it is traditional in Romania as much as in Georgia and Chechnya, which may persuade us to consider Moldova within the context of East Central Europe, according to Piotrowski's definition. In Albania, it is a similar story. Enver Hoxha maintained such strict control over all aspects of life in the country that artists found the risks of straying from the norm too great. Like in Moldova, much of the artistic experiment that took place during the 1960s and 70s was in painting through the use of non-naturalistic colors and expressionist brushstroke. But even that was not without its risks. In the 1970s, Edison Gergo was sentenced to 18 years in jail for his painting Epic Morning of the Stars, which contained tones that were too blue and too sad for Hoxha. Gergo died in prison. Flutura and Besnik Hajilari, who work as the artistic duo the Two Gullivers, were trained as visual artists in Albania in the 1980s. In the early 1990s, they started to visit the French, German, and American embassies in Tirana, accessing their libraries for material on art and art history that was unavailable elsewhere, learning foreign languages to be able to read them. It was there that they first encountered performance and body art and decided to try it because, as they said, with no background or knowledge of other contemporary art practices, they felt that something so new and different would be a blank slate for them to learn how to create contemporary art that would be competitive on the world stage. Indeed, their performance practice combines tradition and innovation, incorporating drawing, in which they had significant training, into the process of both creating and executing a performance. Their first performance in Albania took place in 1998, more than 40 years after the first happening in New York City by Alan Kaprow. But does this delay have any meaning? I would argue that it does not. One way to begin addressing the peripheries of our own region is also to look at the so-called peripheral dates and turning points as a way of moving on from the before and after binary paradigm, which I maintain can serve to disrupt the East-West model. So instead of focusing on the shifts that occurred from 1989 to 1991, we can look at other significant turning points, such as 1956, 1968, 1974, the fourth constitution of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, 1981, martial law in Poland, for example. In my book, I claim that artists from Eastern Europe developed the genre of performance art in the region concurrently with colleagues in the West, and were both connected to and independent of developments there, creating their own unique brand of performance art. Looking at this a different way, I also propose that artists in the peripheral areas of East Central Europe developed the genre of performance art in the time and space that was relevant to local contexts. If we claim to want to move away from a model that preferences Kaprow over Cantor, then we also need a model that allows for artists such as Popescu and the Hagilaris to occupy an equivalent space with the likes of Knizak. While I acknowledge that everyone cannot cover everything, I think that instead of taking the center to task for its exclusions, we should look to ourselves to see where our own biases lie. I believe the time is ripe for us to recuperate the art and artists of the so-called peripheries of our periphery, lest art historians of the future write an essay entitled, "Why Have There Been No Great Moldovan Artists?" Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.